and spoke a lot the previous session, so I'm here to listen. And I'm a general internist by background and was a primary care doctor until I came to NIH 5.5 years ago. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks, Eliseo. Jonathan Tobin, would you mind going next?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Jonathan Tobin. I'm a cardiovascular epidemiologist and implementation scientist. I'm the president and CEO of Clinical Directors Network, CDN. It's a primary care practice-based research network that works with federally qualified health centers and other safety net practices. We're in New York City, but we work with practice-based research networks and federally qualified health centers across the country. I'm also the senior epidemiologist and co-director for the community engaged research at the Rockefeller University Center for Clinical and Translational Science. The model of team science that we have been building, we refer to as full spectrum translational research that builds comparative effectiveness research and outcome studies, patient-centered outcome studies that embed both mechanistic research at the T1 level and dissemination and implementation research at the T4 level.
Outstanding. Brilliant. Thanks for being with us, Jonathan. Jonathan Watanabe, would you go next?
Hi, Jonathan Watanabe. I serve on the Forum on Drug Discovery, Development, and Translation with a few others on this committee. And I spend half of my time right now giving COVID-19 vaccines at a clinic at the University of California, Irvine. I'm the Associate Dean of Assessment and Quality at UCI, and I'm a clinical pharmacist, health economist, and outcomes researcher by training. But we also have, germane to this, is the real world evidence workshop series. We've got a couple papers coming out that are looking at pragmatic clinical trials and how we can improve inclusiveness. I'm very interested in everything that we're doing here, and like to see a lot of progress made in terms of improving generalizability and inclusiveness.
A lot of progress is right. I think that's a shared motivation. Thanks, Jonathan. Peyton, would you go next?
Certainly. Peyton Howell. I'm Chief Commercial and Strategy Officer at ParExcel. We're one of the large global CROs, and I'm actually representing the Association for Clinical Research Organizations as part of this group. Before joining ParExcel, I had about 25 years completely focused on patient access issues, developing some of the first programs to support patient access to care, reimbursement challenges, and the uninsured, starting with HIV/AIDS, and obviously now through to our challenges related to COVID, and delighted and humbled to be with this group.
Terrific. Thanks, Peyton. Stephanie. Oh, well, Stephanie, thank you for being here. With that, I think I might have got to the, is there anyone else we should do an intro for that I've missed? Okay, terrific. So we've got 2 questions to tackle, and I think it was important to identify who our sort of experts are on the line before we dive in. The first sort of charge for this group is to talk about what are the short-term goals to ensure a more person-centered, inclusive clinical trials enterprise. And the way that I might sort of talk about that is, what does good look like? If it was up to us to define what good looks like in the short term, 2 to 3 years, what is that?
While we're all thinking, what has struck me about this topic is that without a goal, without something that's measurable, I think it's going to be very difficult to make progress. So I think this question about what does good look like and then how do we measure it and who's responsible is absolutely critical for us to make progress. So we better come up with some stuff or we can't, I just don't think we'll make progress.
Yeah, I agree with that. This is Jeannie. I think one of the short-term goals is for everybody to have a goal. If you look across sponsors of pharmaceutical companies, for example, I can only think of a handful of pharmaceutical companies who have publicly gone out and said that not only do they have a commitment to inclusion in clinical research, but they have a goal. For example, Pfizer has put out a goal to say that in the fall of 2021, all of their clinical trials will reflect the epidemiology of the disease under study and or U.S. Census. Now that's a goal. I think that commitments are nice, but goals are better. And I think one of the goals here is to be that every major sponsor needs to say what their goal is.
I think that totally agree with you. Just one maybe idea and a provocative question as well, which is for FDA. FDA has a huge amount of power here, as do the other major regulators. What could they do? What could they require? Should they be requiring something like what you just mentioned, Jean, as coming out of one company? Should they require that for all companies or all registered trials?
So I was impressed listening to one of the vaccine adcoms. The FDA specifically said that they didn't have authority to enforce this and require it, which I think is interesting. I can see a way around it, is they could say they can't approve a drug for a certain population because they weren't included in the trials, but you can imagine what that does to make the access problems even worse.
Yeah, well, as a former FDA official, let me just say, try to be diplomatic. That's sort of a cop-out answer. They may have to do rulemaking, or they may have to, articulate in a public comment sort of period why they're making a change. But of course, they can put these requirements in place.
Yeah. And Jeannie, I think your suggestion is a really good one. I'm very impressed that they're saying end of 2021, because we're proposing that for the end of 2025. But one of the challenges we have right now is getting good data as to what the population diversity is for each disease. It's not so hard for something like prostate cancer or breast cancer that are common and COPD, but it is hard as we start getting into precision medicine where we don't have as much data when you're talking about genetic subsets. We'll get there, but we had started investigating with the University of Washington and the Global Burden of Disease, and they want $6 million to try to bring in all of the diversity health data from around the world. I think that's a great project. I would argue that's something we might want to all do together rather than individual companies. Yeah, and I think that's necessary before we can have we can assess whether our metrics are working, right?
Well, I guess my perspective on this is that we can't go for 100% perfection, and there are some areas where there's not going to be great data, but there is certainly really good data out there. I mean, the National Minority Quality Forum has data for every major chronic disease and some rare diseases, data down to a zip code level demographics, and with demographics and comorbidities. So not very expensive to get access to that data. So that's a good place to start, at least.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that source. That's great. But there are a lot of sources that we probably should be cataloging. And
yeah. And I would just echo Jean. I think having that kind of goal is actually reasonable. I can tell you, we have seen in terms of running trials that when there is a goal, we actually hit those metrics. And when we can't convince the sponsor to create a goal because they're worried of the risk, it's not the same result and not the same outcome.
Right. Yeah, and it seems that CROs are not in the loop in terms of what the goals are.
Well, we try and advocate for goals, but you're right, we don't control the goals.
Exactly.
So LSCO, couldn't NIH require such a goal like we heard about that one of the companies has for all NIH-funded trials? What's standing in the way of that?
Well, I'm not.
I know you can't speak for NIH.
I'm not a legal expert. No, I wasn't going to say that. I can speak for myself and as an institute director, but I don't think this is within the authority of either NIH or FDA, for that matter, to require that people submit studies where their proportional representation based on disease. I mean, the vaccine trials had, at best 30% Latino and blacks, and even though 50% of cases were there. Now, is that 30 good enough? Yeah, probably, based on that no expectation of a biological difference in response to the vaccine. But it's a perception issue, and it's a credibility issue with those communities that already are having a high level of mistrust. What NIH does is, based on the 1993 Act, require investigators to report participants, and that increased the participation of minorities in clinical research. The latest data that are not, I think, public, but I've seen is about 30% of all NIH-sponsored clinical studies and also phase 3 clinical trials. NIH-sponsored, which, we only sponsor maybe at best 30% of all trials, maybe not even that much, have minorities in it. So I think NIH has done some of its part. It could do better, but I do think that there more has to come from those who primarily are funding clinical trials, which is industry. 2 points there. One is separating out U.S. recruited from international recruits. That's a big issue because it's not the same being Latino from Peru as being a Mexican American from L.A. And then the requirement that FDA did ask that the reporting of Latino Hispanic ethnicity only really came into being in the last 3 years. Prior to that, we had no idea. It was all rolled into either whites or other. So I think those kinds of things. The last thing we could do at NIH is create some sort of accountability for investigators. So if I say as an investigator, I'm going to recruit this many people, and at the end they don't meet their goals, we have not ever looked at the idea of creating accountability for investigators to fulfill what they said they were going to do in terms of samples in different racial ethnic groups. So I think that's an area we could step into. Yes.
So I have to disagree with you that you haven't ever. From 1990 to 2000, I was part of the Asthma Clinical Research Network from the NHLBI, and we had a mandate that 30% of our patients that we enrolled had to be Black or Latino, or we wouldn't get our money. They were paying us by the patient. And when we failed, we didn't get the money. And so we stopped failing. And the way we stopped failing was that we recruited to join the network as PIs, Blacks and Latino PIs. And that's what you need to do. We need to bring people from the groups that are missing into the groups that are planning the trials and that are working together. And without that, it's not gonna work. So that's what really makes the difference to me is to get those folks so that we get them in the trials as the leaders of the various centers. That's what we need to do. And that's that's easy for NIH, but for drug companies, they need to have a mandate. They need to see a value in it. And then they need to go out and recruit, not just the guys who did their last set of trials, but the people who can bring them the patients that they need.
I agree with both the last two comments that one, you need to have the accountability and the requirements that's there. I also agree with Steve that I think it's a cop-out for the FDA to say that they can't set those goals. I think with the accountability, though, you have to have what's the negative consequences if you do not meet those stated goals that you come up with. There's no accountability and nothing happens. So you have companies that state a certain goal, they don't meet it, and nothing happens. They continue to get funding. And I think the bottom line is we really need to look at collaboration so that it's collaboration just as we've done with the COVID vaccines, where you have industry and government working together. But you also have to have the community engaged at the planning level to show that they are valuable and an active part of the team that's building and getting the tools or the drugs or the products that's there. And so it's a joint working together collaboration, industry, government, academia, community, as well as providers.
I wonder if I can riff off this a little bit. I want to make sure we sort of start to touch on our second question. So we've talked about what the goals should be. And if I just try and summarize the importance of each individual organization sort of taking a leadership position and stating their own goal, FDA leaning into their public health remit and actually using the full strength of their sort of capabilities to move the needle here. Talked a little bit about how NIH could potentially hold sort of investigators accountable to doing this kind of work. There's a couple of different levers here. Doris, I really liked how you talked about, and in fact, Jeff, you sort of started this piece of the conversation around how we move this upstream. I guess my question is, and excuse my naivety here, is, you know, having all of these accountability pieces feels a little bit like the coach standing at the side of the track telling the athletes to run faster. Right? Well, that's great. Thank you. Do we have, and Nadine, you work on this closely every day, so you might have some ideas. If we put all of those measures into place, Peyton, you sort of said, look, when we set the goals, we usually meet them. But is that true? If we actually could have a perfect structure of goals and accountability, do we have the capabilities to actually make this happen and make it happen in a way that it actually has a positive impact on trust going forward?
Yes, Jennifer, I'm glad that you asked that. I was wondering, you know, as we talk about accountability, so I'm totally on board in terms of really thinking about what accountability looks like. What does it mean to put teeth to table 4, if you will, and with some clear outcomes. And I think one of the things is that as we think about what are some of the best practices that are typically used, in particular around community engagement, as Doris highlighted, I think that one of the challenges I find is that some of our investigators, many of our investigators actually, do not know how to do it. I think we have not done the best job of disseminating best practices of how to actually increase diversity in your study. So now we have people who know how to do it, fill out a table 4 because it's easy to fill out and you just kind of put whatever you need. But what kinds of resources have we put into place, in both at the institution level, but also at the national level as well in the feds? And so I think that there needs to be kind of a wraparound process, because I think it's also that sometimes the punitive most certainly can work in some cases, but also we want people to actually want to do this because it actually is good science. It's good practice. And so if we kind of change some of that dialogue by providing those types of resources to wrap around it, I think that that's huge. I know that that's definitely played a difference for us here at Duke for certain, as we've really kind of built out more and more of our community engagement work. We have our communities playing a key part in our study designs, and they're involved in the entire piece from beginning to end. And so now many of those advocates now who are advisory board members are also participants in some of our studies after the fact. So again, I think that there's an opportunity there, but really wrapping around, Jennifer, to your question, is really important. We can make mandates, but we also have to set people up for success.
Nadine, do you have evidence that this is working? I know you put it in place. Do you have a sense, a data-based sense that it's actually more effective than what you were doing 5 years ago, for example?
Yeah, so definitely within our Cancer Institute and the work that I've done there over the past 8 years, it's clear that we can see a difference in our increase in particularly the African-American population. We're now seeing that more and more in our Latinx population as well, but not to the same degree yet. And also when we're thinking about our CRUs, now we're actually developing a full systems approach to how do we actually measure and help our teams to start being more effective across the CRUs in this area. So it's not just cancer and oncology, but it actually is across all of our CRUs. So yes, there's definitely impact on that. But I would say that as well as the work that we're doing at Duke, I think Alicia said it earlier, is that there's evidence across the board of people who have actually moved the needle in this space. When we do it well, when we engage with our community partners, and I love the term that was used earlier, we slow down. We have a study now that's a 5-site study that I'm the state director of stakeholder engagement with this study. It's funded by PCORI. And we actually were recruiting more white people than we were black. So we stopped and we held back on the white and we put more focus around engagement. We engaged our stakeholders. We actually developed a model where for each of the sites, and there's 6 sites altogether, each site has its own stakeholder advisory council. So not just having one advisory council that just responds to this whole regional differences, that you can't talk about North Carolina and Southwest Texas and think that that board is going to speak to those needs. So we really created that and invested the time. Then we caught up And now we're right on track and doing fantastic in our work with our engagement. So really, people just don't know how this can happen and what the budget looks like to incorporate that in their designs, I think is a huge part.
Has described it perfectly, actually, in terms of what we've seen.
It's kind of obvious that I think needs to change just based on experience talking to a lot of pharmaceutical companies and what Nadine just said. Most of pharma, when they ask for patient input, get a national patient advisory board together to give input, which is good. But what would be better is if they work with lead sites to put together community advisory boards to get that input. Because not doing that makes a big difference. It'll make a big difference, right? So it's different based on where people live. And we must kind of move towards community engagement works, community advisory boards work. Centers know how to do this. We need to listen to their input and incorporate their feedback into the protocol design, involve community-based organizations for outreach. This is where the trust comes in to reach communities. And that input must come from the community, not a national board of patients. So that's a capability that needs to be expanded because we know it works.
Can I just add one thing? And Jonathan, I'm going to call you out here too, Jonathan Tobin, on this, because I really think that that there's an opportunity here when we talk about who's getting large amounts of money to accelerate research, accelerate discovery, at least from the academic side, are our CTSIs and our cancer institutes. They get huge infrastructure money to support this type of work. Not only can they do this then within academics, but they can partner with their local pharma and industry to be able to create those type of opportunities. CTSIs in particular, I think, are well positioned to be hubs, if you will, because they have the community engagement piece, they have the clinical trials piece and the work that they focus on there within diversity, and their role is to actually make a difference both locally, regionally, and nationally. And so, Jonathan, I hate to put you on the spot, and generally, I hope you don't mind, but I would love for you to speak to that because I know we do a lot of that within our CTSI here at Duke with Ebony.
So, sure. Thank you, Nadine. I think that one of the challenges that CTSIs have is not only engaging patients, but also engaging practicing clinicians. Because if we think about the research enterprise and the translation, dissemination, and implementation process, when studies are conducted solely in academic settings that reflect highly select and referred populations, as opposed to community-based settings that reflect usual care, the generalizability, the external validity becomes problematic. And we need to think of this both from a generalizability and from a social justice perspective that, again, depending on where people seek their care determines on whether they will or will not have access to clinical trials. So I'm biased, but I think that practice-based research networks that include communities of practice, that include organizations that are providing care in the usual care settings, that is not necessarily the highest resource settings of academic health centers, are really an important venue for both generating that new knowledge and then being the communications vehicle for widely disseminating, implementing, and scaling up that knowledge. And so there are some really good examples of partnerships between clinical translational science award programs and practice-based research networks, so that sense of engaging the frontline practicing clinicians, first of all, in asking questions that matter to clinicians, the questions that are unanswered, and then designing those studies collaboratively with research experts, practicing clinicians so that they can be embedded in the workflow, and patients who are going to experience that will provide a more accelerated approach to research and implementation.
Yes, exactly. That's huge. And they sit within the CTSIs, our PBRNs, so I think there's a great opportunity there. And I'd also say on the point of investment, and then I promise I'll stop there too. On the point of investment that was raised earlier as well, investing our monies in our community clinics to build their infrastructure to be able to actually conduct clinical research in their settings, and as Jonathan just highlighted, I think is really important, and also investing money in community organizations directly that can actually make a huge difference. COVID-19 has taught us that community health workers, both within the community and those who are lay within the health systems, actually can make a huge difference in increasing diversity. We've seen that in 4 of our clinical trials here and vaccine trials, specifically where we have partnered with faith organizations that actually started their own nonprofit, and as a result have blown out our outcomes in terms of our diversity in our clinical trials for the Latinx and the Black community. And so I think that rethinking how we invest and who we invest in.
That's terrific to hear, Nadine. And one of the my missions is to try to get the pharma companies to do that together. It makes no sense for each company to be investing in a different clinic. We can do this as a coordinated way, and the only way that it'll be sustainable is if we do it coordinated, so it doesn't look like we're there just because today we have this trial, but we're there to stay, and doing it together makes that work. And we need some thinking about what's the best way to pull that all together.
So, and I want to make sure you see that Jonathan has had his hand up patiently for a long time.
I'm sorry.
Well, this will be just a quick comment and more just to kind of stir the pot, because I know we've got still a few more hours to talk about this, but really getting back to that notion of carrots and sticks. So if there's a way to incentivize the process, be it if they meet certain recommendations, then they get funding plus 10% or something. It seems to work pretty well for the Orphan Drug Act in terms of there's incentives for looking at certain things. So could we do the same thing where we look at this with for-profit firms, that manufacturers that want to do trials, as well as NIH, that, well, there's a factor that if there's representation that meets certain expectations, that there'll be some kind of incentive. So it's not just necessarily a penalty, but also that there's a reward. And, that seems to work in a lot of places in academia, where they tell me if I need to have a certain percentage of something, that I'm more likely to achieve it. So maybe that's not so much always a penalty phase, but you'll be more quickly reviewed, or you're more likely to have that funding at a certain number if you meet the specifications that you attested to in terms of recruitment or retention or accrual. Something, I don't know. This just seems to work in so many other places. So there's something to be said about setting up some incentives in terms of measurement.
I think the one other piece that is important is that we have some dissemination back to the community. We come, we use them, we don't go back to say this is the outcome, this is what happened. So I think we have to go full circle to make sure that you're going to come back and disseminate the information based upon findings from the study, and not just put it in a scientific journal. The community is not going to read New England Journal or something else. So you really want to have it some way that you can bring that information back.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to mention something about the carrot stick approach. It has to do with transparency of data reporting. And this is something that some people are working on this, and it has to do with data that is sent by an investigator, whether it's a clinical study or just a human study, outcomes research, to a journal. That the thought is there should be some recommendation by journal editors to capture the racial and ethnic minority status of the population under study in a chart consistent with the Office of Budget Management. So there's some transparency along with age and gender in terms of the population that was studied. And I brought this up because there was a study that was published in JAMA Net a couple of years ago by Loree, Loree, and he and his colleagues reported on cancer trials, clinical trials from the last 10 years. And it was just a review of what was reported in journals in terms of baseline characteristics. And doing that would create some transparency in terms of the population that was studied. And if there are small numbers in some of the boxes, so be it. But the larger research community should be aware of, for any given study, who has been studied so they can answer the next question. Because isn't that the reason why we do research, is to keep answering questions about therapies and interventions that benefit patients?
This is fantastic. I've just, so first of all, I've just seen a note that we have just a minute left. So let me try to summarize very quickly this tremendous discussion. So first of all, everyone, thank you for being part of this lunchtime. This was really important. If I get this right at a very high level, what we need to do is make full use of sort of the full armory of carrots and sticks at all sort of points along the scale. Jeannie, whether from publication all the way through to sort of submission. Jonathan, you talked about some financial incentives, but incentives and accountability wherever possible. Hand in hand with that, we also need a lot of supportive mechanisms to actually help people realize those goals once they are set and once people are trying to enforce them. Nadine, you spoke to that really nicely. And then I think another theme that came out is the importance of doing this collaboratively, whether across the sort of pharma companies, whether that's hand in hand with the communities we're working with. And what I was most pleased about this group was that you also kept in mind as we were talking about the fact that clinical trials, as we understand them, are sort of coming out of the clinic a little bit more into the community, a little bit more real world. And I think everything you mentioned also touched on those aspects. So terrific conversation. This was fantastic. And really, as we sort of codify all this and create, you know, a call to action for the field in the follow-up, this was tremendous. So we'll see you all back in the main room. And thank you so much, everyone.
Great discussion. Thanks, Jen.